That is going to be an update on the Real ID. And we know that, folks, we've been prepping you for this for the last couple of weeks because the deadline to get your Real ID is coming up pretty quickly. That is going to be May 7th. And so we actually wanted to dive in a bit deeper to the whole process of this Real ID and how it actually came about. Why are we even doing this? And whether people realize this or not, this has been decades in the making at this point. So we want to bring in Wingate University political science professor, Dr. Magdalena Krajewska, who's an expert on Real ID. So thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about the concept of this Real ID actually being something that's been in the works for years and years and years. And I think since it's been delayed so many times, people kind of forget the reason why this is even in place, and that it actually has to do with the 9/11 attacks.
Absolutely. So after the 9/11 attacks, the 9/11 Commission found that a number of the hijackers, a number of the terrorists, had obtained driver's licenses, some of them fraudulently, that enabled them to travel around the country and facilitate the attacks. So the Commission recommended that there be more security in the process of issuing driver's licenses, and in particular, that there will be federal standards imposed on how states issue licenses. This led Congress to pass the Real ID Act in 2005.
So, I mean, I believe, the most recent, and as far as my memory goes, the most recent delay that we saw was kind of around the pandemic. I believe it was 2020. It was delayed once again. What are the reasons for all of these delays? Why has there been such a lengthy rollout to this program?
Absolutely. So originally, the law was actually supposed to be enforced in 2008, just 3 years after the law passed. But it took a lot more time for states to actually change their driver's license processes. Some states were opposed to the law for various reasons, including cost and some other reasons. So then finally, the deadline was moved to 2020. But as you said, that was during the pandemic. And once the pandemic hit and DMV offices were closed and people were obviously, afraid to leave their house because of coronavirus, that deadline was postponed yet again until we actually got this current deadline of May 7th, 2025, which is, so soon from now.
Yeah, and I mean, so we'll just remind folks once again, May 7th, you have to have that star on your ID to be able to fly domestically and enter certain federal facilities. And as you pointed out, Doctor, this is all, in an effort to make sure that these forms of identification are actually verified in light of what we saw with the terrorist attacks of 9/11. Something interesting to point out, because you've done a lot of research on this and you've published, publications, research, books on this specific issue, but also just really the larger issue that this can kind of inform. And that's, I guess maybe if I could summarize it, like a federal-state relationship, and how do you get the federal and state to work together and inevitably roll out a program that you're trying to get done on the federal level to all the states, right?
Yes, absolutely. This is part of my research for sure. As you said, I wrote a book on the subject, and I wrote a journal article in which I explored this relationship between the federal government and the state governments, because it took a lot of cooperation between the federal government and state governments. But this issue of homeland security, this issue of terrorism prevention, is obviously so key, and so many different stakeholders have to be on board to make it happen. And it looks like we finally do have all states on board with this. All states are now issuing those Real ID compliant driver's licenses. Again, it took 20 years for that to happen, but all of them are now issuing those much more secure driver's licenses.
Yeah, and I mean, I saw in some of your research you talked about the fact that it seemed to be more of a success because it didn't go through some state governors who were probably more resistant to these changes, or even, state legislators. It went through the DMV, which had a stake in actually in enforcing this policy. Is that correct?
Absolutely, that is correct. As you said, some governors were opposed largely because of cost measures. They just worried that it will cost their states a lot more money than it actually did to change those processes. But the DMVs were very much on board with this legislation because they knew that it's very important to issue documents that are issued in a safe manner and are issued to people that really truly are who they say they are. So obviously DMVs, they do not like fraud. They do not like someone to present fraudulent identification documents to them. They do not want to issue documents to people who are not who they say they are. So DMVs were actually really on board, and that allowed for all the states to eventually roll out this process and issue those Real ID compliant licenses.
Really interesting stuff. It's so great to kind of do a little bit of a deeper dive into a topic that we've brought folks and kind of, on a surface level, just kind of warned them that this deadline was coming up. So we really appreciate your time, Dr. Magdalena Krajewska with Wingate University. And we'll just remind folks watching at home that if you don't get your Real ID on time and you still want to try to access all of these different activities that we mentioned you need the Real ID for, maybe it's time to take a look at getting that passport out, because that could probably be another alternative for folks.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for reminding everyone about this. And yes, you can use a passport. You can use certain other identification documents, perhaps a military ID, perhaps a veteran health card. There's a list of all those documents on the TSA website, the DHS website, and we also recommend consulting your DMV website as well. But thank you so much for your interest in this really important topic.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Krajewska. Hope you have a great day.
Absolutely. You too. My pleasure. Thank you. Bye.